The result of the Austrian Grand Prix was thrown into confusion by a bizarre situation involving one of F1's most divisive topics. The FIA's policing system was overwhelmed by an astonishing scenario at the Red Bull Ring in which close to 1,500 instances of a car breaching track limits had to be reviewed. It resulted in 12 extra penalties for 8 drivers long after the race had finished, changing several positions in the top 10. So what on earth happened? Was this a new low for the thorny issue of track limits? And what, if anything, is going to be done about it? More than 100 lap times were deleted in the Austrian GP as drivers repeatedly exceeded track limits, mainly on the entry and especially the exit of the final corner. That resulted in 7 drivers, Lewis Hamilton, Yuki Tsunoda twice, Carlos Sainz, Alex Albon, Logan Sargent, Kevin Magnussen and Pierre Gasly receiving time penalties during the Grand Prix. But it later transpired that a 4-figure sum of potential offences had to be reviewed by race control, so many that there wasn't time to get through them all during the race. The Red Bull Ring is notorious for track limits offences, particularly at turn 10, as the compression mid-corner can cause cars to wash out wide, and the wide curbs on entry and exit allow drivers to take liberties in extending the track as much as possible. It escalated to an extreme degree this year though, with complaints about deleted laps in qualifying merely a precursor to an astonishing rate of infringements in the race. Aston Martin protested the provisional classification because a number of cars were not penalised for exceeding track limits. The steward said they had become aware of the existence of multiple deleted laps due to exceeding track limits that were drawn to their attention after the receipt of that protest. An examination of the list of these laps revealed a number of track limits infringements had not previously been referred to the stewards and in fact did warrant a penalty. FIA Race Control was duly tasked with reviewing a significant number of potential infringements that there was not time to handle during the race, and this was completed on Sunday evening. Inevitably, there were more penalties. While the top 3 remained the same, Max Verstappen winning from Charles Leclerc and Sergio Perez, there were changes in the points positions and outside the top 10. 4th place finisher Carlos Sainz got a 10-second penalty, as did Lewis Hamilton, who finished 6th, and Pierre Gasly in 9th. It promoted Lando Norris to 4th and Fernando Alonso to 5th, while Sainz dropped to 6th. Hamilton dropped behind Mercedes teammate George Russell, while Lance Stroll gained 9th ahead of Gasly. So Aston Martin gained 3 points, while its Constructors' Championship rival Ferrari lost 4, so you can see why it was motivated to make sure the FIA looked into this. Non-point scorers Alex Albon and Logan Sargent also got 10-second penalties. Esteban Ocon received 30 seconds worth, while Nick De Vries picked up 15 seconds and Yuki Tsunoda 5. Beyond impacting the classification, this situation was an admission that the FIA's policing system simply could not keep up with what it called an unprecedented situation. Since last year, a zero-tolerance policy of using the white lines to police track limits has been applied. It succeeded a more flexible track-by-track approach with corner-specific instructions, which had benefits but led to criticism because of perceived inconsistencies. The white line policy was the case last year too though, and the reason for the higher rate of deleted times and penalties at the Red Bull Ring in 2023 is simply that the FIA is policing it better. It has more human resources at its disposal this year to monitor transgressions, with 9 personnel across race control and its remote operations centre in Geneva. A mix of automatic loops and fixed, zoomed-in cameras being monitored by these personnel are used to note offences and refer them to the stewards. So it's extremely likely that there were not actually a dramatically higher number of offences this year than before. It's just that a more rigorous method of policing has exposed more of them. As a consequence, the system of dealing with that, noting the offences, reporting them, reviewing them and penalising them or not, was utterly overwhelmed. There wasn't enough time to review everything, and it's possible some were missed as well. Unsurprisingly, everyone is keen to avoid a repeat, and the stewards said they very strongly recommend that a solution be found to the track limits situation at this circuit. The FIA is already on the case. It intends to renew its recommendation that the Red Bull Ring adds a gravel trap at the exit of turns 9 and 10, following what it called an unprecedented situation, something that was also suggested after last year's race but clearly fell on deaf ears. A gravel trap is the solution that world champion Max Verstappen and others have advocated, but it has previously been made difficult primarily because MotoGP races at the Red Bull Ring. Tracks that host 2- and 4-wheeled categories tend to avoid gravel traps where possible because it's unsuitable for bikes and, more importantly, the riders that fall off them. The FIA said that while it is not a straightforward solution in relation to other series that race here, it has proved to be very effective at other corners and circuits with similar issues. Demanding gravel traps be installed may sound like an easy solution, but it's a pretty selfish position for the FIA to take on behalf of F1. Yes, F1 is the pinnacle of the sport, so it makes sense to prioritise it, but this ignores the fact these circuits need to operate and prosper for the other 51 weeks of the year when the Grand Prix circus isn't in town. Gravel traps are expensive to implement and maintain, especially compared to asphalt runoffs. And when lesser categories with lesser drivers race or test at these circuits, having gravel trap runoffs means more cars getting stuck when drivers make a mistake and spin off. That causes more disruption and potentially robs grassroots competitors of valuable and expensive track time. Should a driver paying their own hard-earned money to race for fun have a worse experience because the best drivers in the world can't keep their F1 cars inside a white line unless there's a gravel trap the other side of the curb? Even if the FIA, F1 drivers and the teams calling for gravel traps were willing to pay for their installation and upkeep, which seems unlikely, the circuits would still lose out in the long run. Heavily disrupted events and tests would eventually lead to other championships and drivers deciding it's not worth running at the circuits, costing them money. Money may be less of an issue for track owner Red Bull, but it clearly hasn't found the case for installing more gravel traps compelling enough up to now. And ultimately, if F1 stakeholders are saying that the drivers would be able to stay within track limits if there was gravel on the outside of those corners, then that means they're capable of doing it without putting gravel there. Whether this draws a definitive line under the Austrian GP results is debatable, for any team that's lost out may want to challenge their belated penalties. What it will not resolve is the wider debate about track limits. When F1 reconvenes at Silverstone for the British Grand Prix and in the intervening days, several questions are bound to be asked. Is F1's rule correct? Is an even more robust policing system needed? Or do the drivers just need to literally toe the line? There is bound to be debate over whether this saga proves F1's track limits rule is inherently flawed or has just exposed the fact that drivers have got away with taking liberties at this track for too long. The zero tolerance rule exists for a reason. A couple of years ago there was a lot of criticism about rule inconsistencies and different guidelines for different tracks and corners. It was a nice idea in principle, but it seemed to fail in reality. And apparently teams and drivers were in favour of a one rule everywhere approach. They've also repeatedly complained about aggressive curbing being used as a deterrent because it can cause accidents and simply damage the cars that run over them. The argument for using the white line is simple. Every corner at every track can have a white line denoting the edge, whereas natural deterrents like grass and gravel cannot be applied in the same way everywhere. That is why the final corner of the Red Bull Ring is no longer policed with the exit curb as the natural limit, even though it would work because drivers who go too far wide there will lose time crossing the curb edge. But if we park the discussion about whether the rule to police track limits is right or wrong for a moment, this is the current rule being enforced properly, and it exposed a farcical number of offences. Regardless of the challenge of the track, which is clearly a big factor, you can bet if F1 re-ran this race we wouldn't have as many problems because drivers now know how closely they're being watched and they can't take liberties like before. Blaming it on the track for encouraging such chance taking when you know these are the rules doesn't feel right.